My son walked into my care facility room with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his plan had finally worked. He covered my hand with his and said softly, "You don't have to worry about anything anymore, Mom. We'll manage it all for you." I lowered my eyes and let my voice tremble just enough to convince him. After 30 years on the bench, I knew exactly how dangerous people sounded when they disguised control as kindness. But what my son never realized was that every confused smile, every forgotten word, every weak moment he saw from me had been carefully prepared long before he ever walked into that room. Thank you for choosing to stay. Before this story unfolds, tell me where you are watching from. Your city, your country, leave it below. Every comment reminds me why I tell these stories. This story includes fictional elements crafted for storytelling and educational depth. Names and settings are coincidental, but what this story has to say is something I hope stays with you. The last gavel. The last time I sat behind the bench in courtroom 4, the room was completely empty. I had asked for that. 30 years of verdicts, 30 years of watching people unravel under the weight of their own choices. I did not want a ceremony for the end of it. My clerk had arranged things exactly as I requested. A quiet Tuesday morning in late September. No press, no photographers waiting to capture the moment. Eleanor Vance, Associate Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, surrendered her gavel for the last time. I sat there for almost an hour. The courtroom smelled the way it always had, old wood floor wax, and something underneath that I could never quite name. Authority, maybe, or consequence. I had learned over the decades that those two things often smell very much the same. I was 60 years old. I had spent more than half my life in rooms like this one, reading faces, measuring words, deciding what was true and what was performance. My husband Robert used to say I was the only person he had ever known who could tell the difference between a man who was sorry and a man who was merely sorry he had been caught. He said it like it was a compliment. I always told him it felt more like a weight. Robert had been gone for 3 years. He passed in the autumn of 2021 quietly, the way he had lived without drama, without complaint, with his hand in mine. After 34 years of marriage, losing him was like losing the foundation of a building. The walls were still standing, but I felt every crack, every draft, every shift in the ground beneath me. I picked up the gavel one final time. It was heavier than it looked. It always was. Then I set it down, straightened my jacket, and walked out of courtroom 4 without looking back. I have found in this life that looking back is a habit that rarely serves you. By 2 p.m, I was on the ferry to Martha's Vineyard. The island had been in Robert's family for 4 generations. The house, a white and gray Victorian sitting back from the water on 3 acres of old oak and salt grass, was not simply a vacation property. It was the kind of place that carries the memory of everyone who has ever lived inside it. Robert had proposed to me on the back porch on a September evening, much like this one, 36 years ago. We had brought our newborn son home to that house. We had buried Robert's mother from the front steps on a winter morning when the harbor was frozen solid. I loved it the way you love something that holds the weight of everyone you have ever been. When I came up the long gravel drive, Julian's car was already parked near the side entrance. My son Julian Vance was 38 years old and looked every year of it. He was tall like Robert, but where Robert had worn his height naturally, Julian always seemed slightly uncertain inside his own frame, as though something did not quite fit. He managed an investment fund out of Boston, a mid-sized operation handling other people's money, and the work had given him a good suit, a downtown apartment, and a particular kind of restlessness I had watched grow worse over the past 2 years. I could not name it precisely. But I had spent 30 years reading people professionally, and I knew the difference between a man who was tired and a man who was afraid. He was waiting on the front porch when I came up the steps, and he hugged me with the particular warmth of someone who wants something, but has not yet decided how to ask for it. "Mom," he said, "you look great. How does it feel being retired?" "Ask me in a week," I said. Behind him, stepping through the front door with a champagne glass already in her hand, was his wife. Clara Ashford Vance was 36 years old, and she was the most deliberately assembled person I had ever encountered. Not beautiful the way beauty happens without effort, but beautiful the way it requires daily maintenance. The right clothes, the right posture, the precise expression calibrated for each room she entered. She had married Julian 4 years ago, and in all that time I had never once seen her caught off guard. "Eleanor," she said, and kissed the air near my cheek with practiced warmth. "Congratulations, the end of an era." She had brought champagne, a French bottle with gold foil, the kind chosen to impress. She pressed a glass into my hand before I had set down my bag. We sat on the back porch as the afternoon light stretched long across the water. Julian talked about a financial conference he had attended in Chicago the previous week. Clara listened the way people listen to background music, present, but not engaged. And her eyes moved. That was the thing I noticed. Her eyes moved around the porch, then through the open door into the sitting room, then across the water, then back to the antique sideboard in the hallway, then to the crown molding original to the 1890s construction. She was not admiring any of it. She was measuring it. I had spent 30 years distinguishing between someone who appreciates a thing and someone who is calculating its worth. Clara was doing the second. At one point, she turned and found me watching her. She smiled a lovely, precise smile that arrived exactly on cue and disappeared just as cleanly. I smiled back. They left just before 7. I stood on the porch and watched Julian's taillights disappear down the drive and fade into the early dark. The oak trees Robert and I had planted the year Julian was born moved quietly in the September wind. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table and thought for a long time. Then I reached for the phone. The blueprint. The fog came in off the harbor sometime after 10, the way it always does in September on the vineyard, quietly without announcement, until the oaks at the edge of the property had disappeared into gray, and the water beyond them was nothing but sound. I had not called Constance from the kitchen table the way I had planned. I had sat there for a long time, first listening to the house settle around me and watching the fog thicken against the window glass. Some decisions I have found deserve a few more minutes of silence before you set them in motion. At 11:45, I went to the study. The study was Robert's room more than mine, his books still on the shelves in the order he had arranged them, his reading chair still angled toward the lamp, his handwriting still visible on the index cards he had used to mark pages he wanted to return to. 3 years since his passing, and I had not moved a single thing. Not out of grief, though grief was present enough, but because the room still felt inhabited by the particular quality of his thinking, and I was not ready to let that go. In the back wall behind the painting of the harbor that Robert's mother had commissioned in 1961 was the safe. It was a standard fireproof residential model, the kind that holds what matters most, deeds, insurance documents, the things you cannot replace. Robert had installed it the year Julian turned 25. He'd given me the combination in a sealed envelope, handed it across the kitchen table without ceremony, and said only, "If something happens to me before I tell you what's inside, open it then." Something had happened to him 2 years later. The envelope inside was thick cream-colored, sealed with his signet ring in wax, the way his family had done for 3 generations. On the front, in his careful engineer's handwriting, he had written one word, Ellie. I had opened it the week after his funeral and read it twice. Then I had placed it back inside the safe, relocked the door, and spent the following 18 months hoping I would never have to think about it again. That hope had not survived the previous 6 months. I took the envelope to the desk, sat down under the lamp, and read it a 3rd time. Robert had written 7 pages front and back in the steady, unhurried hand of a man who expected to be understood. He had laid out everything: the structure of the family trust, the charitable foundation he had quietly established a decade earlier, the specific protections he had built around the Martha's Vineyard property. And at the end, in a paragraph he had set apart from the rest, he had written about Julian. He had been watching the same things I had watched. He had seen them earlier and more clearly because he had not been softened by hoping he was wrong. At 12:15 in the morning, I called Constance Darby. Dr. Constance Darby was 62 years old and had been my closest friend for 31 years. We had met during a medical ethics case I had presided over early in my career, back when she was a young internist, giving expert testimony with a composure that most senior attorneys never manage. She ran a private internal medicine practice now out of a brownstone in the South End of Boston, and she was one of perhaps 4 people on earth whose judgment I trusted without reservation. She picked up on the second ring. She always does for me. "I was wondering when you would call," she said without preamble. "You knew I would. You've been quiet for 3 months, Ellie. You're only quiet when you're deciding something." I told her everything. I told her about the private investigator I had retained in March, a careful, thorough woman named Frances, who had spent 11 weeks documenting what I had suspected and hoped I was wrong about. Frances had delivered her report on a Tuesday evening, sitting at this same desk, and I had read it straight through, without stopping, the way you read something you cannot afford to misunderstand. Julian's investment fund was in serious trouble. Not the normal trouble of a difficult market cycle, but the deeper trouble of a man who had been quietly using client funds to cover personal losses from high-stakes private card games hosted through a network of affluent Boston contacts. The practice had been going on for at least 2 years. His total exposure, counting what he owed and what he had already moved without authorization, came to approximately $2,300,000. He had 6 months, possibly fewer, before the discrepancy became impossible to conceal. And Clara. Clara had been meeting Silas Thorne for 14 months. I explained to Constance who Silas Thorne was because she had never moved in political circles. He was 65 years old, a former state senator from Rhode Island who had spent the better part of 2 decades building influence across New England through a combination of legitimate political work and arrangements that were considerably less legitimate. He and I had been adversaries during a judicial misconduct investigation I had overseen 9 years ago. He had escaped that process with his reputation intact, but only because one key piece of evidence had been ruled inadmissible on a procedural technicality. I had kept a copy of that evidence. I had kept it because Robert had told me to 7 years before he died. Thorne is patient. He had written in the letter I had just reread for the 3rd time. He will wait until he thinks you cannot fight back. Make sure you can. Constance was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said, "Are you absolutely sure, Ellie? Once you begin this, there is no version of it that ends quietly." I looked down at Robert's handwriting on the cream envelope under the lamplight. The fog outside had swallowed the entire property. I could hear the water, but not see it. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. Patient reported symptoms. 3 days after my phone call to Constance, I sat in her private office in the South End of Boston and watched her type with the careful precision of someone who understands that every word in a medical document carries legal weight. Her office was on the ground floor of a narrow brownstone, furnished in the particular way of rooms that are meant to put anxious people at ease. Good chairs, soft lighting a window that looked out onto a courtyard with a Japanese maple, still holding its summer green. I had sat in this room many times over the years, sometimes as a patient, more often simply as a friend who needed a place to think. This time I was something in between. "I want to be absolutely clear about what I am doing," Constance said without looking up from her screen. "I am documenting what you have reported to me, your own description of your own experiences. Nothing more." "I understand," I said. "In standard medical practice, a doctor is both required and permitted to record what a patient tells them about their symptoms. If a patient reports forgetting names, losing track of conversations, feeling disoriented in familiar places, the doctor writes it down. The doctor does not necessarily confirm or diagnose, they document. The record belongs to the patient's file and reflects what the patient has communicated." Constance was doing nothing outside the boundaries of her profession. She was recording symptoms I had described. The fact that I had not actually experienced those symptoms was my business, not hers. She had made clear she would not certify a diagnosis she had not made. What she would provide was a letter summarizing a patient consultation, noting the concerns I had raised about my own cognitive function and recommending further evaluation. It was, she told me flatly, the only way she could help me without compromising her license. It was also exactly what I needed. She printed the letter, signed it, and slid it across the desk without ceremony. I read it once, folded it, and placed it in my jacket pocket. "This is going to be harder than you think," Constance said. She had swiveled her chair to face me fully the way she does when she has something to say that she needs you to actually hear. Not the legal architecture of it. You built the legal architecture 30 years ago on the bench. You can do that in your sleep. I mean the other part. Which part? The part where you sit in a room with your son and pretend not to be yourself. I thought about that on the drive back to the ferry. I thought about it on the water crossing, watching the island materialize out of the gray October overcast. I had presided over fraud cases for 3 decades. I had watched skilled liars construct alternate versions of reality and inhabit them with apparent ease. I had always assumed from the outside that the mechanics of deception were relatively simple. You decided on a story and you told it. I spent the following week discovering how wrong I had been. The difficulty was not remembering what to forget. It was the discipline of being always slightly less than yourself, of letting the wrong word arrive a half-second too late, of allowing a familiar name to sit just out of reach when it should have come immediately. It required a specific kind of sustained attention, the attention of someone performing the absence of attention, and it was exhausting in a way I had not anticipated. I practiced in the mirror. I practiced during my morning walks along the water. I practiced at the kitchen table with no one watching just to build the reflex. By the second week of October, I was ready. Julian came on a Saturday alone, telling me Clara had a prior engagement in the city. He brought groceries, the particular mix of practical and indulgent that signals a guilty conscience in a son, and made lunch while I sat at the kitchen table and watched him move around a kitchen he had grown up in. We ate. We talked. And then, at a natural pause in the conversation, I looked at him across the table and said with a small, uncertain frown, "I'm sorry, remind me again. Your wife's name." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Julian's face moved through something I recognized from the bench, the rapid internal calculation of a person who has just received unexpected information and is deciding how to respond to it. It was there and gone very quickly. What replaced it was concern. Warm, attentive, immediate concern. "Clara, Mom," he said. "Her name is Clara." "Of course," I said, and shook my head lightly. "I don't know where that went. I'm sorry." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. It was a tender gesture. I did not let myself think too hard about whether the tenderness was genuine. An hour later, Julian stepped out onto the back porch to make a phone call. I was in the sitting room near the window that looks out to the side garden, and the Victorian walls of this house did what Robert always said they would do. They carried sound in ways that newer construction does not. I heard his voice low and deliberate, the tone of a man choosing his words carefully in case he was overheard. "She didn't know Clara's name," he said. I know. But listen. She's worse than I thought. This might be faster than we planned." He paused, listening. "Then, I'll call you when I'm back in Boston." I stayed very still by the window until I heard him come back inside. He found me in the armchair with a book open in my lap, and I looked up with the mild, slightly unfocused expression I had spent a week perfecting. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Everything's fine, Mom," he said. "Everything's just fine." He did not know I had heard him. He did not know that these walls had held the conversations of 4 generations of his family, and that the house remembered every one of them. Robert had always said it had ears. He was right. Maplewood. On the 3rd Thursday of October, Julian drove me from Martha's Vineyard to Fall River in his silver sedan, and I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap and watched the Massachusetts coastline give way to the gray industrial edges of the city. He talked most of the way. He talked about the traffic on Route 24, about a restaurant he and Clara had tried in the South End, about how the autumn had come early this year. He was doing what people do when they are uncomfortable, filling the silence with anything that fits. I let him fill it. I was occupied with watching the landscape change and thinking about what Dorothea Crane had told me 3 days earlier. Dorothea Crane was 58 years old and had been my attorney for 14 years. She was a small, precise woman who had spent her career specializing in estate law and asset protection, the unglamorous but essential work of making sure that what people build over a lifetime does not get dismantled by carelessness or by the ambitions of others. I had hired her initially to restructure the family trust after Robert's diagnosis, and over the years she had become the person I called when I needed something done quietly and done correctly. She had visited Maplewood Care Facility on the Monday before my admission, presenting herself to the front desk as a family representative, conducting a preliminary assessment of the accommodations. It was a routine visit, entirely unremarkable. Families do this regularly before placing a relative in a care facility. She had been shown to room 14 on the second floor, had asked several reasonable questions about meal schedules and medical protocols, had thanked the administrator for his time, and had left. She had also, in the 4 minutes she spent alone in room 14, while the administrator stepped out to retrieve a brochure, taped a slim prepaid phone to the underside of the bed frame as far back against the wall as her arm could reach. Maplewood Care Facility occupied a converted 3-story building on a side street 6 blocks from the waterfront. It was not a bad facility precisely. It was simply an indifferent one, the kind of place built to a standard of adequacy rather than care. The lobby smelled of industrial cleaning solution and something warm and overcooked from the dining room down the hall. The lighting was fluorescent throughout, the kind that flattens everything and makes people look unwell regardless of their actual condition. The director came out to meet us. Norbert Griggs was 55 years old, heavy-set, with the particular professional manner of a man who has learned to seem attentive while thinking about something else entirely. He was the administrator Dorothea had met on Monday, efficient and curious, primarily interested in ensuring that the paperwork was completed without complications. He shook Julian's hand, nodded pleasantly at me, and led us to his office. The admission forms were a standard set: medical release authorizations, emergency contact designations, financial arrangement documents for the monthly fee. Julian sat across from Griggs and moved through them with a speed that told me he had not read a single page. He signed where indicated, initialed where required, and had the entire packet completed in under 5 minutes. At one point, while Julian was signing, Clara arrived. She had followed in her own car, and she came into Griggs's office carrying a small cream envelope, which she placed on the edge of his desk with a particular deliberateness. Griggs picked it up without comment and placed it in his desk drawer. I noted the exchange and said nothing. It was the kind of arrangement that tends to surface on its own when investigators begin asking questions. I did not ask what was in it. I already knew the kind of arrangement that travels in small cream envelopes. Gloria Finch was the nurse on duty that afternoon, a woman of 48 with a direct manner and the unhurried competence of someone who has been doing the same job long enough to see every version of every situation. She walked me down the corridor to room 14 while Julian and Clara signed the final forms with Griggs. I could hear them talking in the office behind us, their voices low and efficient, the sound of people completing a transaction. Gloria unlocked the door to room 14 and pushed it open. It was a small room, a single bed, a dresser, a chair by the window, a bathroom with grab bars installed along the walls. The window looked out over the parking lot. A framed reproduction of a coastal watercolor hung above the dresser, the kind of print you choose when you want something inoffensive. Julian appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. He looked around the room once, a single pass of his eyes that took in the bed, the window, the watercolor, and said nothing for a moment. "Good enough," he said quietly. He said it to Clara, who was standing just behind him. He did not say it to me. They did not stay long after that. Julian hugged me at the door with genuine seeming warmth, told me he would call tomorrow, and promised to visit on the weekend. Clara touched my arm briefly and said something appropriate. Then they walked back down the corridor, and I watched them go from the doorway of room 14, their footsteps receding, their voices dropping to something I could not hear, and then the sound of the lobby doors closing behind them. Gloria Finch was still in the room, making a note in her chart. She did not comment on what had just happened, but she looked up at me once before she left, and the expression on her face said what she was too professional to put into words. Then she was gone too, and the door was closed, and the room was quiet. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin and firm. Outside the window, a car was pulling out of the parking lot, and beyond the roof lines, the October sky was a flat, even gray. I sat there for a while, long enough to feel genuinely and completely the particular quality of being alone in an unfamiliar place with no immediate prospect of leaving it. Then I reached under the mattress. The phone was exactly where Dorothea had left it, taped to the frame flat against the wall, completely invisible unless you already knew it was there. I worked it free carefully, turned it over in my hands. The screen lit up when I pressed the side button. One message from a number saved under the name DC. It read, "Room secured, proceed when ready." I had work to do. I learned what happened at the vineyard that weekend, the same way I learned everything from inside Maplewood through a 14-year-old boy and a small screen in the dark. Beckett Vance was Julian and Clara's only child, and from the time he could speak in complete sentences, he had possessed a quality I recognized from his grandfather, an absolute stillness at the center of himself that other people's noise could not disturb. He was 14 now, slight and quiet, the kind of boy who reads 4 grade levels ahead and prefers the company of one person. He trusts to any group of people he does not. He had his grandfather's eyes steady and direct, and he had always sat closer to me at family gatherings than to anyone else in the room. While the adults filled the air with conversation, Beckett watched and listened and said very little, and what he said, when he said it, tended to be the most precise thing in the room. I had relied on that precision for years without fully naming it. Now I was depending on it completely. 3 weeks before my admission to Maplewood, I had told Beckett the truth. Not all of it. He was 14, not 40, and there is a form of respect in deciding how much weight to place on someone who has not yet had the years to build the architecture for carrying it. But enough. I had told him that I was not sick, that I was doing something necessary, and that I needed his help in a way that no adult in my circle could provide, not because they were less capable, but because no adult could move through his parents' home without raising the kind of attention that would end everything before it began. He had listened to the full explanation without interrupting once. When I finished, he had asked me exactly 2 questions before he agreed. The first was, does this hurt anyone who doesn't deserve it? The second was, does Grandpa Robert's letter say to do this? I told him yes to both. He nodded once slowly, the way his grandfather had nodded when he had considered something fully and arrived at his conclusion. Not a gesture of casual agreement, but of genuine settlement, the kind that does not reverse itself. That was the end of his deliberation. The system he set up was straightforward in design and required a 14-year-old's fluency with technology to execute correctly. He wore a small clip-on camera, the kind designed for outdoor sports documentation, no larger than a shirt button, connected via short-range wireless signal to his tablet. When the tablet's private livestream application was active and my account was logged in on the prepaid phone Dorothea had left in room 14, whatever the camera saw, I saw in real time. There was no installation of equipment in anyone else's space, no hidden devices in rooms he did not belong in. He was a teenager in his own family's house carrying a personal device streaming privately to his grandmother the way teenagers stream privately to each other every hour of every day. I had put the question of legality to Dorothea before I put the request to Beckett. Her answer had been careful and unambiguous. Any material captured this way would not be introduced as primary evidence in legal proceedings. It was investigative direction, a map pointing law enforcement toward evidence they could obtain through proper channels. The recordings would tell investigators where to look. They would find what was there themselves through methods that left no procedural question. That distinction mattered precisely because it was real, not merely convenient. Dorothea was not the kind of attorney who manufactured distinctions to make her clients comfortable. Julian had taken Beckett to the vineyard that Friday evening, describing it as a family weekend. Clara had arrived separately on Saturday morning, and an hour after she arrived, so had Silas Thorne. I was lying on my side on the narrow maplewood bed, the prepaid phone held at an angle, so the screen's glow would not be visible under the door gap when the stream connected at 11:47 that morning. The room around me was all institutional quiet. The distant sound of a television somewhere down the hall, the periodic sound of footsteps in the corridor, the faint hum of climate control doing its indifferent work, and on the small screen in my hand, the front sitting room of the house where Robert and I had raised our son, lit by the pale October light coming off the harbor. Silas Thorne was 65 years old, and he had not improved with age. He was a large man who carried his size the way powerful men sometimes do, as though the space around him belonged to him by default, as though rooms contracted slightly when he entered to make room for the particular gravity of his self-regard. He had served 3 terms as a Rhode Island state senator before moving into the profitable ambiguity of private political consulting, which in his case meant leveraging 2 decades of relationships with elected officials for clients who preferred not to appear in any public record. 9 years ago, I had overseen a judicial misconduct inquiry that had come uncomfortably close to the financial arrangements that sustained his influence. He had survived it. He had also, I was quite certain, never forgiven me for the discomfort the process had caused him, regardless of its inconclusive outcome. He and Clara stood in the front sitting room while Julian was somewhere upstairs. Beckett's camera was positioned through the partial gap of the study door, angled precisely enough to capture the sitting room without being visible from it. He had chosen the angle himself. I had not instructed him on this detail. He had simply identified the problem and solved it. I watched Clara hand Thorne a folded set of documents. He opened them, reviewed them with the practiced speed of a man accustomed to absorbing financial summaries, and nodded. The property is worth between $4 and $4.5 million, Clara said. Her voice had the particular quality it got in professional contexts, stripped of warmth, purely functional. The voice of someone communicating data rather than speaking to a person. If we move before the end of the year, we can have it transferred before anyone thinks to look at the trust structure carefully. Thorne refolded the documents and held them loosely at his side. I have someone for this. He's handled sensitive transfers before. No complications. He said it with the easy confidence of a man who has said it many times in many rooms and had not yet encountered the complication that would teach him to say it more carefully. The man he meant was Warren Price. 3 days later on the stream, I watched Warren Price walk the vineyard property with a measuring application running on his phone and the particular expression of a man pricing something he expects to profit from. Price was 50 years old, a licensed real estate broker operating out of Cape Cod with a client list that included several of Thorne's associates and the relaxed professional manner of someone who has learned that asking fewer questions produces fewer complications. He wore a good jacket and moved through the house with a proprietary ease that told me he had already decided in his own accounting of the situation that the outcome was settled. I watched him walk the back porch. I watched him stand at the window of Robert's study and look out at the water, the way people look at things they are mentally converting into numbers. The oak trees Robert and I had planted the year Julian was born were moving in the October wind beyond the glass, and Warren Price looked at them the way you look at landscaping. I heard Thorne's voice from the hallway off camera, but clear. Standard title verification takes 3 weeks minimum. We don't have 3 weeks. Price did not hesitate. Skip it, he said. You've confirmed ownership. That's enough for my purposes. He said it easily without visible discomfort, the way professionals say things they should not say when they are certain no one outside the arrangement is present to hear them. A title search, the standard process by which a licensed real estate professional confirms who legally owns a property before initiating any transaction, is not a procedural formality. It is the foundational step on which every legitimate transfer of property rests. Skipping it is not an efficiency. It is, depending on the circumstances and the intent, a breach of professional obligation that can reach the level of criminal conduct. Warren Price had just made the second biggest mistake of his professional life. The first had been answering Silas Thorne's phone call. Beckett sent me a compressed clip of the key exchange that night along with a full timestamp log of the session. I watched the central sequence 3 times the phone screen, the only light in the dark room, the parking lot outside my window, orange and empty and completely indifferent to what I had just witnessed. Then I typed back 2 words. Good boy. Visiting hours. 13 days after I arrived at Maplewood on a gray Wednesday afternoon in late October, I heard the most welcome sound in the world. Sneakers on linoleum. The hallway outside room 14 had a particular acoustic quality. Hard floors, low ceilings, the kind of corridor that transmits footsteps clearly and without flattery. I had learned the gaits of the regular staff within my first 3 days. Gloria Finch walked with a brisk, no-nonsense rhythm. Norbert Griggs moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who considers his time more valuable than it is. The night orderly shuffled. This was none of those. This was the fast, light, slightly uneven step of someone young and moving with purpose. I closed the Law Review Journal I had been reading a 2-year-old issue of the Massachusetts Law Review inside, which I had placed the actual document I was studying, a 40-page appellate brief Dorothea had sent, folded inside a get-well card from a fictional cousin, and set it on the bedside table with the cover facing up. The knock was soft. 2 taps, then 1. The signal we had agreed on. Come in, I said. Beckett Vance pushed open the door with his shoulder because both hands were occupied, one carrying his backpack and one holding 2 boxes of cookies from the Portuguese bakery on Pico Street in New Bedford, the place his grandfather had taken him every Saturday morning for the first 8 years of his life. He had remembered. He looked at me for a moment from the doorway, taking in the room with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything. The single bed, the watercolor above the dresser, the parking lot beyond the window. Then he looked at me directly, the way children do before they learn to look around things instead. You look okay, he said. I am okay, I said. He came in, set the cookie boxes on the dresser, dropped his backpack on the floor, and sat in the chair beside my bed. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt and the kind of worn canvas shoes that teenagers treat as a uniform. His hair needed cutting. He sat with his elbows on his knees, leaning slightly forward, which was exactly the posture his grandfather had used when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. Gloria Finch appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later, checked that Beckett had signed the visitor log at the front desk he had. He was thorough about the things that mattered and told us visiting hours ended at 5. Norbert Griggs rarely reviewed the visitor log personally. His arrangement with Clara concerned broader matters than the daily administrative register of a care facility. Beckett's name in the log was to him invisible. Then she pulled the door to within an inch of its frame and moved away down the corridor. She was the kind of nurse who understood that privacy is sometimes more therapeutic than any clinical intervention. When her footsteps had faded, Beckett leaned forward another inch and dropped his voice to just above a whisper. Grandma, he said, I know you're not sick. He did not say it as a question. He had not said it as a question the first time, either 3 weeks ago at the vineyard when I had told him the truth. He stated it the way he stated everything he was certain of, plainly without performance. I looked at him for a long moment. He had Robert's coloring and Robert's stillness, and most importantly, Robert's eyes, that particular quality of attention that makes the person you are looking at feel genuinely seen rather than merely observed. It is a rarer quality than most people realize. I had encountered it in 30 years of courtrooms perhaps a dozen times. I had married it once. And here it was again in a 14-year-old boy in a gray sweatshirt, sitting in a chair in a care facility room in Fall River, waiting patiently for me to respond. No, I said, I am not sick. He nodded. Nothing in his face changed. He had already known. The confirmation simply allowed us to move forward. The files I sent Dorothea, he said, were they what you needed? They were exactly what we needed. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car navigated the parking lot below the window. Somewhere down the hall, a television was playing at a volume calibrated for hearing loss. "What comes next?" he asked. I had thought carefully about how much to tell him. He was 14, and there is a line between trusting a child with the truth and burdening them with a weight that belongs to adults. But Beckett was not a child in the way that requires protection from complexity. He was a young person who had already chosen deliberately and with open eyes to be on the right side of a difficult situation. He deserved to know what that meant going forward. I told him there would be a document, that someone would come to the facility and ask his father to sign something, and that when that happened, it was important that no one outside the plan knew I had been expecting it. I told him to continue monitoring, but to be careful Clara was perceptive, and complacency was the thing most likely to expose him. He listened without interrupting, which was more than most adults managed. "Is it going to work?" he asked when I had finished. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Your grandfather spent 10 years building something very carefully," I said. "And your grandmother spent 30 years learning how systems fail. Between the two of us, I think we covered the contingencies." The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. The same gesture Robert made when something struck him as both serious and slightly absurd simultaneously. We ate the cookies. They were the kind with the sugared lemon glaze that Beckett knew I preferred. He had asked for them specifically. I did not comment on this because I did not trust my voice entirely in that moment to remain as steady as I needed it to be. At 4:45, he stood up, shouldered his backpack, and picked up the empty cookie boxes. "I'll come back next Wednesday," he said. "I will be here," I said. He paused at the door. For a moment, he looked much younger than 14, a boy who loved his grandmother and was doing something frightening because he believed it was right. Then the moment passed and he was steady again. "Okay," he said, and he walked out. I listened to his sneakers recede down the linoleum corridor, growing fainter until they disappeared into the ambient sound of the building. I sat very still in the chair he had vacated, which was still warm. I had spent 30 years on the bench reading people. Defendants and witnesses, attorneys and plaintiffs, the guilty and the wrongly accused. In all of that time, across all of those faces, I had met very few individuals whose character I would describe without reservation as genuinely good. This boy was one of them. 0. I did not see what Julian did that night. I did not need to. There's a quality to a guilty man's voice the morning after he has discovered something he was not supposed to discover, a particular thinness, a careful steadiness that is trying too hard to pass as natural. I had listened to that quality across 30 years of courtrooms, in the voices of defendants who had spent the night consulting attorneys and arriving at positions they had not yet fully inhabited. I knew it the way a musician knows a slightly flat note. It is not wrong enough to be obvious. It is wrong enough to be unmistakable. Julian called at 8:23 in the morning, 3 days after Beckett's visit. I was sitting on the edge of my bed eating the oatmeal Gloria Finch had left on the tray by the door, gray and institutional but warm, when the prepaid phone vibrated once in my jacket pocket. The number was his. "Mom," he said. "How are you feeling today?" He asked about my sleep. He asked whether the staff were treating me well. He asked whether I needed anything from the house, some of my books perhaps, or the blue cardigan I liked. His voice was warm and solicitous and moving at a slightly higher velocity than his normal speech. He was talking to fill silence. Guilty men always talk to fill silence. "I'm fine," I said, making my voice soft and a little vague at the edges the way I had practiced. "A little tired. I slept late." "Good," he said. "That's good. You should rest." He paused. In the pause, I could hear him deciding whether to say the next thing. He decided not to. "I'll try to come by this weekend," he said instead. "Maybe Saturday." "That would be lovely," I said. After I ended the call, I sat quietly for a moment with the phone in my lap. Then I called Dorothea. What Julian had done the night before I pieced together partly from inference and partly from what Beckett confirmed to me 4 days later when he sent a short message through the secure application he went in after midnight. Found it in about 20 minutes. A cold wallet is in essence a physical device, something resembling a small thumb drive that stores access credentials for a cryptocurrency account entirely offline. Unlike money kept in a bank which exists as a digital record on a connected server, cryptocurrency in a cold wallet is secured by a private key that exists nowhere but on that device. The device can be held in your hand. It can be hidden in a drawer, a safe, a piece of jewelry. Without the private key, the account is inaccessible to anyone on Earth, including the account holder. Robert had purchased the device 9 years before he died, at a time when he was beginning to quietly convert a portion of the family's liquid assets into cryptocurrency as a long-term hedge. He had placed $12 million worth of Bitcoin across 2 wallets, and he had embedded the access credentials, a 24-word recovery phrase, in a form that would be meaningful to exactly one person. The inside of my wedding ring, engraved in characters small enough to require a jeweler's loop, arranged in an order that corresponded to a numbering system. Only Robert and I knew the phrase was invisible to anyone who did not already know where and how to look. Robert had shown me the system the year before his diagnosis. He had told me what the wallet contained and how to access it, and then he had said, "If Julian ever comes looking, I want him to find it. I just don't want there to be anything left when he does." He had thought of that. Even then, 9 years ago, he had thought of that. 2 years after Robert's death, working with Dorothea and a cryptocurrency compliance attorney, she trusted I had transferred the entire contents of the wallet. Bitcoin's value had declined in the intervening years. The $12 million Robert had originally purchased had settled at $10 million by the time of the transfer. That $10 million converted and distributed in legally structured payments went to a verified list of individuals whom Julian's fund had harmed through misrepresentation and unauthorized use of invested capital. The transfer had been coordinated with a preliminary inquiry by federal securities regulators filed under a protective seal that kept Julian's name out of public records while the investigation remained open. The case file number was 2019-FIN-447. When Julian found the ring and accessed the wallet that night, he found an account with a balance of $0 and a transaction record showing a single outgoing transfer to a non-profit fiduciary administering restitution payments. The notation read in the flat language of financial compliance final distribution complete. Beneficiaries verified claimants per case file. 2019-FIN-447. His name was in that file. He had spent months believing that the combination to a $10 million inheritance was sitting on his mother's finger. He had put his wife in an affair with a corrupt former senator. He had placed his mother in a facility that smelled of floor wax and overcooked food. He had signed forms he did not read and made calls he thought no one could hear. And the vault had been empty the entire time. I thought about that as I sat on the edge of the maplewood bed, the oatmeal growing cold on the tray, the parking lot gray and quiet outside the window. He had called to hear my voice, to confirm I was still confused, still soft, still the manageable problem he believed he had neatly contained. I had given him exactly the voice he needed to hear. Gentle and slightly distant, the voice of a woman receding from her own life. Then I had ended the call and dialed Dorothea. "He found it," I said when she answered. And now he knows," I said, "which means they will move faster, which means we need to be ready." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular quality it gets when she has shifted from consideration into execution. "The document," she said. "I think it's time." Escalation. Beckett sent me the next clip 48 hours after Julian's phone call. I watched it at 2 a.m, lying on my side with the phone screen dimmed as low as it would go, and the thin blanket pulled up to create a barrier against the gap under the door. Through the wall to my left, I could hear the faint sound of the night orderly's television at the nurse's station, some late program with a laugh track. The contrast between that sound and what I was watching on the small screen was significant enough that I noticed it. The clip was 17 minutes long. Beckett had sent only the key portion 8 minutes with a timestamp note at the top. The recording was from his bedroom in the Boston apartment where Julian and Clara lived, taken through the partially open door that faced the living room. The audio was clear. He had positioned himself well. Clara was pacing. I had never seen Clara pace before. In the 4 years since Julian had brought her to a family dinner and introduced her as someone he was serious about, I had watched her move through every social environment with the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who has decided in advance exactly how they wish to appear in each room. Pacing was not part of that. Pacing was what happened when the calculation had not yet produced a result. Julian was sitting on the couch. He had his elbows on his knees and he was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who's recently been told something he had not wanted to hear. Silas Thorne was in the armchair by the window. I had not seen Thorne in 9 years, not since the final days of the misconduct inquiry I had overseen, when he had sat across a conference table from me with the polished composure of someone who has made peace with the possibility of exposure. He looked older now, as people do, but the composure was intact. He watched Clara pace with the patience of a man who has learned to let other people exhaust themselves before speaking. When she finally stopped, he spoke. "The wallet was a setback," he said, "not a defeat." Clara turned to face him. $10 million is not a setback, Silas." "No," he agreed, "but the house is still worth 4.5, and there is a more direct path than the sale." What Thorne proposed was a petition for guardianship and conservatorship. In Massachusetts and most other states, the law provides a mechanism for a court to appoint a decision-maker for an adult who is no longer able to manage their own affairs. Guardianship covers personal decisions, where a person lives, what medical treatment they receive. Conservatorship covers financial decisions, their assets, their accounts, their property. When both are granted to the same person, that individual gains nearly complete legal authority over another adult's life. The petition requires medical evidence, a court hearing, and the appointment of an independent evaluator, a guardian ad litem, to assess the situation and report to the judge. It is a process designed to protect vulnerable people. It is also in the hands of people willing to abuse it, a mechanism for legal capture. Thorne explained this to Clara and Julian with the calm fluency of someone who had thought about it carefully before arriving. "We already have the doctor's letter," Clara said. "Constance Darby's assessment." She meant the patient-reported symptoms document. She had seen only what she was supposed to see, a letter from Eleanor's physician describing cognitive concerns. She did not know what it actually contained or what its limitations were. Combined with testimony from immediate family, Thorne continued, and supporting documentation from the care facility, it should be sufficient to initiate the petition. Once a petition is filed, the court typically appoints a guardian ad litem to conduct an evaluation. That process takes 8 to 12 weeks in the normal course. Julian looked up. "That's months. We don't have months." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "I have a relationship," he said carefully, "with a retired clerk of the probate court who now works as a private guardian ad litem. He has been used in sensitive family matters before. His evaluations tend to be completed efficiently." I set the phone down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. What Thorne was describing, directing the appointment of a specific evaluator through a back-channel court relationship, was not a gray area. It was corruption. The guardian ad litem process exists to provide independent assessment, not assessment pre-selected by an interested party. Any communication designed to influence who the court appoints outside of the formal process constituted an improper ex parte contact with the justice system. It was exactly the kind of arrangement that had brought Thorne close to exposure 9 years ago. He had not learned anything. On the screen, Julian shifted on the couch. "I don't know if we should—" "Julian!" Clara's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Your mother signed herself into that facility. She can sign herself out. If she does that, if she recovers her clarity before we have legal authority, everything we have done to this point means nothing. Do you understand that—" He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Clara turned back to Thorne. "How long to file the petition?" "A week," he said, "but perhaps less." I picked the phone back up and watched the remaining 40 seconds of the clip. Clara sat down across from Thorne, and they began discussing documentation. Julian stayed on the couch with his elbows on his knees and said nothing else. Somewhere in the bedroom behind the partially open door, Beckett had gone very still. I stopped the clip and set the phone face down on the mattress. Clara had stopped calculating the ways to take my money. She had moved on to calculating how to take my rights. In 30 years on the bench, I had watched a great many people convince themselves that what they were doing was necessary, even justified. The ones who frightened me most were not the ones who knew they were wrong. They were the ones who had genuinely stopped asking the question. Clara had stopped asking. In my experience, that is when people become truly dangerous. Julian had just opened the wallet and found nothing but a list of names he recognized as his own victims. But that was only the beginning. Before I tell you what Dorothea found in those 47 files, drop the word "still" in the comments right now. Just that one word. It tells me you are with me, and that matters more than you know. A quick note: portions of this story include fictional elements added for depth and reflection. If that is not what you came here for today, this is a perfectly fine place to stop. 47 files. The call from Dorothea came on a Thursday morning while I was eating breakfast. It was the second week of November, and the light through the room 14 window had taken on the particular quality of New England winter, approaching low, diffuse, the kind that makes the middle of the day look like late afternoon. I had grown accustomed to the rhythms of Maplewood by then. The breakfast cart at 7:30, Gloria Finch's morning round at 8, the distant sound of the occupational therapy session in the common room beginning at 9, with its cheerful instructor who spoke to everyone in the facility at the same volume, regardless of their actual hearing. The prepaid phone vibrated in my jacket pocket at 8:44. "I finished going through everything last night," Dorothea said without preamble. She sounded the way she sounds after a very long day of work, not tired exactly, but compressed, as though she has been thinking in a smaller space than usual and needs room to expand. 47 files, Ellie. Beckett is methodical. He has his grandfather's discipline. "I know," I said. "Sit down if you're not already sitting." I was already sitting. I told her so. She began with what she had expected to find. The recordings of Clara and Silas Thorne together at the vineyard were clear and legally useful. As investigative direction, they established the relationship, the coordination, the intent. Silas's instructions to Warren Price regarding the title search had been captured in sufficient audio quality to be transcribed accurately. Warren's agreement was unambiguous. These were the foundation. Then she moved to what she had not expected. Among the 47 files Beckett had accumulated over 6 weeks was a 23-minute recording from a Tuesday afternoon in October, taken through the wall between his bedroom and Julian's home office in the Boston apartment. Julian had been on the telephone. Beckett had not known at the time whether the call was significant. He had been recording everything that met his established threshold for potential relevance, which he had described to me as anything that sounds like numbers or lawyers. The call had involved both. The man Julian was speaking with was his accountant, a 50-year-old financial professional named Denton Marsh, who had managed Julian's personal accounts and those of the investment fund for the past 6 years. Marsh was not a dishonest man in any dramatic sense. He was something more ordinary and in some ways more dangerous, a competent professional who had allowed himself to become gradually comfortable with arrangements that sat at the edge of legality, the way a person becomes comfortable with a draft by moving slowly enough not to notice the temperature dropping. In the recording, Julian was discussing what he called a rebalancing of the offshore structure. An offshore account, for those unfamiliar with the terminology, is a financial account held in a foreign jurisdiction, typically one with favorable tax treatment and less regulatory transparency than the United States. Holding such an account is not inherently illegal. Failing to disclose it to the Internal Revenue Service or using it to conceal income from federal taxation is a serious federal crime. The relevant law, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, and the associated reporting requirements under the Bank Secrecy Act carry significant criminal penalties for both the account holder and, under certain circumstances, the professionals who assist in concealing the arrangement. Julian had been routing a portion of the fund's undisclosed losses through an account structure in the Cayman Islands for at least 4 years. Marsh knew about it. In the recording, he was expressing discomfort, not moral discomfort, but the practical discomfort of a man who has calculated his own exposure and found it higher than he is comfortable with. If this comes up in an audit, Marsh said in the portion of the recording Dorothea read to me verbatim, the paper trail goes directly to the Cayman entity. I cannot clean that up retroactively. Julian's response was to ask Marsh to handle it. Marsh said he would see what he could do. 23 minutes of conversation captured through a bedroom wall by a 14-year-old with his grandfather's discipline had just added federal tax fraud and conspiracy to a list that already included securities violations and financial misconduct. Dorothea, I said when she had finished. Yes. What is our actual position? She was quiet for the length of time it takes a careful person to choose precise words. We have documented evidence of a conspiracy to defraud you of your property and legal rights, she said. We have audio establishing Thorne's coordination with Clara and his attempt to corrupt the guardian ad litem appointment process. We have Warren Price on record agreeing to conduct a fraudulent real estate transaction. And we now have enough to direct federal investigators toward Julian's offshore structure, which they will find without any help from us once they know where to look. She paused. What we do not have, she said, is the legal gateway that allows a federal investigator to access Julian's financial records without a formal warrant process. We need a document that opens that door from the inside, something Julian provides voluntarily without understanding what he is providing. I set the phone against my shoulder for a moment and looked at the parking lot below the window. A gray November sky, a delivery truck reversing slowly between the lane markers. The authorization to release financial records, I said. Exactly, Dorothea said. If Julian signs a document authorizing the release of his own financial records to a designated third party, in this case, an entity I will establish for the purpose, federal investigators can access those records without triggering the warrant process that would alert him. He opens his own files, voluntarily, with his own hand. She said it the way she says things she considers legally elegant. And how do we get him to sign? She asked. I had been thinking about this since the morning Julian opened the wallet and found nothing since the phone call with his too careful voice, since the question that had been waiting for its moment. We give him a reason to come to me, I said. A reason that feels urgent, that feels like an opportunity. He will come. And when he does, he will sign whatever Dorothea puts in front of him because he will be too focused on what he thinks he is gaining to read what he is actually giving away. There was a brief silence. The fall, Dorothea said. Yes, I said. Make the arrangements. I ended the call and placed the phone back in my jacket pocket. Outside, the delivery truck had finished its maneuver and was pulling away toward the street. The parking lot was empty again, still and gray and completely ordinary. I sat with that ordinariness for a moment. Then I thought about Robert, who had spent 10 years building something careful and precise, and who had trusted me to know when to use it. I thought the time was very nearly now. The fall. On a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of November, I took 2 Advil, apologized silently to my left hip, and let myself go. It was not a dramatic fall. I am 60 years old, not 90, and I have enough respect for my own skeleton not to do anything irreversible in the service of a legal strategy. I stepped to the edge of the area rug beside my bed, turned my ankle deliberately against the raised border, and went down sideways onto the linoleum with enough controlled force to make a convincing sound without doing any real damage. Then I stayed there and called for help with the genuinely undignified quality that comes from lying on a cold floor in a facility that smells of cleaning solution. Gloria Finch was the one who found me. She came through the door within 45 seconds, which told me she'd been closer to my room than usual. I had wondered over the preceding weeks how much Gloria Finch had understood about the particular nature of my situation. She asked no unnecessary questions. She helped me to the bed, assessed my hip with practiced efficiency, noted that nothing appeared broken, and told me she was going to call my family. I told her that was probably a good idea. Julian arrived at 2:50 in the afternoon, 50 minutes after the call, faster than the drive should have taken, at that hour, which told me something about the urgency with which he had left. He came through the door of room 14 with his coat still on, and his face carrying the specific expression of a man in the process of deciding how concerned to appear. There is a version of parental worry that is entirely genuine, and a version that is a performance of itself constructed for witnesses. I had learned over the years to distinguish between them. Julian's version was somewhere in the middle, real enough to be uncomfortable for him, managed enough to tell me he had thought about something else during the drive. He sat beside the bed. He asked if I was in pain. I told him my hip ached, and that I had been frightened by the fall, and I let my voice carry more tremor than was strictly necessary. His hand covered mine on the blanket. "We're going to make sure you're safe, Mom," he said, "whatever it takes." I looked at him. He meant it. That was the particular cruelty of the afternoon, not that he was entirely false, but that there was enough genuine feeling underneath the calculation to make the calculation bearable to him. He had convinced himself that wanting my money and wanting my safety were compatible desires, and the effort of maintaining that conviction had become invisible to him. Dorothea arrived at 3:15. She had coordinated with Maplewood's administrative office 2 days earlier, registering herself as a legal services representative retained by the Vance family to assist with healthcare planning documentation, a routine role that care facilities accommodate regularly, as families with complex financial situations often retain legal counsel to manage the documentation that accompanies long-term care. Norbert Griggs had added her to the approved visitor list without comment. She was the kind of woman who moves through institutional processes without friction. She came into the room with a leather portfolio under her arm and the brisk professional warmth of someone conducting a necessary but uncomplicated task. She introduced herself to Julian as the family's estate documentation specialist, a description accurate enough to be unchallengeable, and explained that she needed a brief signature on a standard authorization form related to the management of financial accounts during a period of medical care. "It's routine," she said pleasantly. "We simply need someone in the family to authorize the release of relevant financial account information to the appropriate oversight parties so that your mother's assets can be properly monitored during her stay here." The document she placed on the bedside tray table was a single page printed on legal paper with a cover sheet that read in plain typeface at the top, "Authorization to release financial records and account information to designated financial oversight entity." The title was not hidden. It was not obscured or buried in language. It sat at the top of the page in 12-point type, clearly legible to anyone who looked at it. Julian did not look at it. He was looking at me. His mother lying in a care facility bed with my hand on the blanket and my hip aching from a fall, and the document in his peripheral vision was a form to be signed. One of the many forms that accumulate around a family member in a care facility, the steady administrative weather of institutional life. He picked up the pen Dorothea offered, found the signature line she indicated with a professionally pointed finger, and signed. He put the pen down and looked at me again. "Is there anything else you need, Mom?" he asked. "I can stay for a while." I told him I was tired and that I needed to rest. He nodded, squeezed my hand, and told me he would call tomorrow. Then he stood, nodded to Dorothea with the vague courtesy of a man who has just completed a minor administrative task and left. His footsteps went down the corridor. The lobby doors sounded at a distance. Dorothea closed the portfolio with the signed document inside. She did not hurry. She placed the portfolio under her arm, straightened her jacket, and looked at me across the bed for a moment. Then she gave me the smallest nod I had ever seen in my life. A single, precise movement. Nothing wasted. In the doorway, Gloria Finch stood with her chart clipboard held against her chest and her face arranged in an expression of complete professional neutrality. She had witnessed the signing as an incidental presence. She'd been in and out of the room throughout Julian's visit as nurses are. She had not been asked to witness anything. She had simply been there. Our eyes met for a moment. She looked down at her chart and made a note that had nothing to do with what had just happened. I closed my eyes. I thought about Robert, who had spent a decade anticipating this particular afternoon with the patient precision of a man who understood that justice is not always a single event, but sometimes a very long preparation for one. I thought about the authorization to release financial records, now traveling in Dorothea's portfolio toward the office of a federal financial oversight liaison who was expecting it. I thought about Julian driving back toward Boston, relieved that the afternoon's task had been simple. I said nothing out loud, but somewhere in the quiet of my own thinking I said, "Robert, are you watching this?" I believed in the way you believe things you cannot prove that he was. The empty title. I learned what happened at the vineyard that Thursday from Dorothea, who called me at 4 p.m. with the particular quality of calm in her voice that she reserves for moments when things have gone exactly as planned. 3 days after Julian signed the authorization document in room 14, Warren Price drove his silver sedan across the Bourne Bridge and on to Cape Cod, then caught the ferry from Woods Hole to Martha's Vineyard with a folder of documents on the seat beside him and the manner of a man who considers a transaction already complete. He had a buyer, a developer based in Connecticut who had been looking for large waterfront properties on the vineyard for the better part of 2 years. The asking price was $4,200,000. Warren had negotiated a commission structure favorable to himself and had prepared the purchase and sale agreement with an efficiency that reflected the fact that he had skipped the one procedural step that would have made his work meaningful. A title search, the standard process by which a licensed attorney or title insurance company searches the public records of the Registry of Deeds to confirm who legally owns a property and whether any liens, encumbrances, or competing claims exist against it, takes between 3 and 10 business days in Massachusetts. It is not optional. It is the foundational verification on which every legitimate real estate transaction rests. Warren Price had skipped it on Silas Thorne's instruction. He presented the purchase and sale agreement to Julian at the vineyard that Thursday morning. Julian reviewed it in the way Julian reviewed documents with the cursory attention of a man who has decided in advance to sign. He initialed the pages Warren indicated and signed the final page where Warren pointed. Then he shook Warren's hand with visible relief, which was the relief of a man who believes he has solved a problem. Warren drove back to the ferry with the signed agreement and forwarded the package to the closing coordinator, which was, as the parties had agreed, Dorothea Crane's office in Boston. This was the mechanism Eleanor and Dorothea had set in motion 4 months earlier. As part of the estate documentation Dorothea had quietly structured with Julian's nominal cooperation in earlier paperwork, her office had been designated as the coordination point for any transactions involving Vance family assets. The designation had seemed routine. It was not routine. Dorothea received the package at 2 p.m. She opened it, reviewed the purchase and sale agreement, noted the property address, and conducted the title search that Warren Price had declined to perform. It took her 11 minutes. The Registry of Deeds record for the Martha's Vineyard property was unambiguous. The parcel, the Victorian house, the 3 acres of oak and salt grass, the back porch where Robert had proposed on a September evening 36 years ago, had been transferred by Eleanor Ruth Vance to the Vance Family Charitable Foundation on March the 14th, 2016. 8 years and 8 months before Warren Price had driven across the bridge with his folder of documents. The foundation, a registered nonprofit organization under Massachusetts law, held the title absolutely. Eleanor, as an individual, had not owned the property in nearly a decade. Julian had no legal interest in it whatsoever. The purchase and sale agreement he had just signed was an attempt to convey title he did not possess to a buyer who would have paid $4 million for a property. No one in this transaction had the legal authority to sell. The contract was void, not voidable void. Null from its inception. Dorothea called Julian at 3:15. I was not on that call, but she described it to me an hour later with the compressed precision of someone reconstructing an event they found professionally satisfying. Julian had been quiet for a long moment when she read him the registry entry, the kind of quiet that is not thoughtful silence, but the silence of a system encountering information it cannot immediately process. Then he had said, "That can't be right." Dorothea had told him she understood it was unexpected and that she would forward him the registry documentation so he could review it with his own counsel. She'd been helpful, thorough, and entirely without visible satisfaction. She told me he had called Clara before he had finished the conversation with her. She could hear him dialing on a second line as they were wrapping up. I thought about Robert that afternoon lying in the narrow maplewood bed and listening to the sounds of the facility settling around me. I thought about the March afternoon in 2016 when we had sat across from Dorothea in her Back Bay office and signed the foundation documents. Robert had been in the early stages of his illness by then, but his thinking was still clear, still precise. He had understood that the house could not be protected by simply owning it. Anything you own can be taken from you through legal process or familial pressure or the slow erosion of age. The only things that survive that pressure are the things you have given away to something larger than yourself. He had given the house to the foundation, to the educational programs and community initiatives it funded, to the idea that a piece of land could serve a purpose beyond inheritance. Julian had tried to sell a house that had belonged to something larger than himself for nearly a decade. He had not sold a house. He had signed a document and shaken a man's hand and felt relieved, and none of it had meant anything at all. Dorothea said Clara went silent when Julian told her, completely silent in a way that was apparently more frightening than anger. And in Providence, Rhode Island, 60 miles from the registry of deeds that had just rendered 4 months of planning, worthless Silas Thorne's phone rang. I could not know how long he looked at the screen before answering. But I had known Silas Thorne for 20 years, and I knew that he was above almost everything else, a man who understood when a situation had changed. I imagined his face when Julian told him. I found that I did not feel satisfaction exactly. What I felt was something quieter, the recognition that the thing Robert had built carefully and without drama had just held. What Lyle told Dorothea. I did not know what happened in Silas Thorne's Providence office the night of the title search failure until Lyle Garrett called Dorothea 6 days later. She told me everything on a Tuesday morning, her voice carrying the measured quality of someone reconstructing events in careful sequence. The call from Dorothea came while I was sitting in the common room at Maplewood for the first time. I had been avoiding the common room because it required sustained performance. The slightly unfocused gaze, the small hesitations in speech, and performing continuously for an audience of strangers is more exhausting than performing for people who know you. But Gloria Finch had suggested with the gentle professional firmness of someone managing a patient's perceived isolation that I might benefit from spending some time outside my room. I had complied. I sat near the window with a cup of tea and watched the parking lot and waited for the prepaid phone to vibrate, which it did at 8:52. I walked back to my room before answering. Dorothea told me that on the evening of the day, Julian had received the news about the foundation's ownership of the vineyard property. The same evening, Silas Thorne had looked at his phone and calculated the new shape of his situation. Thorne had called Lyle Garrett into his Providence office and given him a single instruction: destroy everything. Lyle Garrett had worked for Silas Thorne for 11 years. He had been hired initially as a political researcher, the kind of position that exists in the offices of ambitious men to accomplish tasks that cannot be described in formal job listings. Over time, as Thorne had moved from elected office into the profitable architecture of private political influence, Lyle's role had evolved into something more comprehensive and less definable. He handled what needed handling. He knew things. That was his value. He also knew, as Dorothea explained it to me, that men like Silas Thorne do not protect the people who handle things. They protect themselves. The people who handle things are protected only as long as their protection is convenient. Thorne's instruction was to access the firm's internal server, a private system that held 20 years of communications, financial records, and documentation related to Thorne's various arrangements, and permanently delete the files pertaining to a specific category of transactions. Lyle knew which category Thorne meant. He had been maintaining those files for 8 years. What Thorne did not know, because no one had told him, was that the server had been subject to a federal preservation order for the preceding 3 weeks. The preservation order had originated from the securities fraud investigation into Julian's investment fund, the Federal Case, whose file number appeared in the cold wallet transaction record. When Dorothea had provided the Federal Financial Oversight Liaison with the signed authorization document Julian had unknowingly given her, the investigators had used it to map the full scope of Julian's financial relationships. That mapping had led them to Thorne's firm, which had provided certain financial consulting services to the fund. A preservation order, a legal directive requiring an entity to retain and not destroy documents potentially relevant to an investigation, had been issued through standard federal process and served on Thorne's firm by a process server on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks prior. Lyle had signed for it. He had not told Thorne about it. Whether he had withheld that information deliberately or simply forgotten in the press of other matters was something I did not ask Dorothea about. Some questions are less important than their answers. When Lyle attempted to execute Thorne's deletion order, he found the server locked under the preservation directive. The files could not be deleted. More importantly, the attempt to delete them had been automatically logged, generating a record showing that someone at Thorne's firm had tried to destroy documents under a federal preservation order, which is a separate criminal offense regardless of whether the deletion succeeds. Lyle had sat in front of his screen for a long time. Then he had called Dorothea Crane. He had found her name through a search of public records related to Eleanor Vance attorneys associated with Eleanor's estate matters. It was not a sophisticated search. He was not trying to be sophisticated. He was trying to survive. He had asked whether Dorothea was in a position to facilitate what federal investigators call a proffer session, a structured conversation in which a potential witness or defendant provides information to investigators under a limited agreement that the statements made during the session cannot be used against the speaker in a subsequent prosecution. It is not immunity. It is a protected conversation, a way for someone with knowledge to demonstrate the value of their cooperation before committing to a formal agreement. Dorothea had told him she would make the appropriate calls. The proffer session had taken place the following day in a conference room at a federal building in Boston, with representatives of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit present. Lyle Garrett had spent 4 hours describing Silas Thorne's arrangements, the bribery payments to state officials across 2 decades, the financial relationship with Clara Ashford Vance, the coordination around the vineyard sale, and the guardianship petition, and the specific instance of directing Warren Price to skip the title search. He had given them everything. In exchange, he was offered a cooperation agreement, a formal arrangement under which his cooperation would be considered by the prosecution in determining any charges brought against him. It was not a guarantee, but it was substantially better than what he faced as Thorne's subordinate if he said nothing. Dorothea finished her account and was quiet for a moment. "He gave us everything," she said. I looked out the small window of my room at the gray November sky. A single gull was moving across it, heading toward the water. The parking lot below was empty except for 2 cars in the staff section and a delivery van whose driver had gone inside. Agent Norma Steed was the name Dorothea gave me next, a special agent with the FBI's Boston field office assigned to financial crimes with a record of prosecutions in securities fraud and public corruption cases that Dorothea described as thorough and methodical. She had been briefed on the full scope of what the investigation now encompassed. She was ready to proceed. "Then it's time," I said, "call Agent Steed." I set the phone face down on the bed and sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. I had waited the better part of 2 decades for Silas Thorne to make exactly this move, to look at an approaching consequence and reach for destruction rather than accountability. I had known with the patience of someone who has watched human behavior from a bench for 3 decades that he would eventually do it. Fear makes predictable people of us all. He had made his move. And in making it, he had handed the investigation everything it needed to finish what Eleanor Vance had started on a quiet Tuesday in September, sitting alone in an empty courtroom, holding a gavel for the last time. 3 in the morning. On the 27th of November at 3 in the morning, I made my bed for the last time at Maplewood Care Facility. It is an odd thing to describe making a bed at 3 in the morning in a room you have occupied for 6 weeks and will never return to. I did it with care, smoothing the thin blanket, straightening the pillow, leaving the room in the condition in which I would have wanted to find it. Old habits, perhaps, or something closer to respect for the space that had served its purpose without complaint. I had packed the night before, which was not a complicated task. I had arrived at Maplewood with a small bag of practical things, and I was leaving with the same bag and very little else. The Law Review Journal, with its hidden contents, had been returned to Dorothea the previous week. The prepaid phone was in my jacket pocket. The room looked when I finished as though no one had ever been particularly inconvenienced by it. I left an envelope on the pillow. Inside was a handwritten note and a personal check drawn on an account that bore no connection to the Vance family name, a private account I had maintained separately for the better part of a decade for purposes that required discretion. The note was brief. It thanked Gloria Finch for her professionalism, her discretion, and the particular quality of attentiveness she brought to her work, the kind that notices things without commenting on them, which is one of the rarer forms of human intelligence. The check was for an amount that I considered appropriate and that she could accept without obligation because it was given without any. I had nothing further to leave. At 3:14, I walked down the corridor of Maplewood Care Facility for the last time. The building was quieter at this hour than it ever was during the day. The institutional hum reduced to its lowest register. The night orderly station flickering blue from a muted screen, a sound of slow breathing from behind closed doors. I did not pass anyone. I reached the lobby, pushed through the main door, and stepped outside into the November dark. The air was cold and tasted of salt from the harbor 6 blocks away. After 6 weeks of climate-controlled interiors, it was the first real air I had breathed, and I stood in it for a moment with my bag on the ground beside me and let it be what it was. Dorothea's car was idling at the far end of the parking lot with its lights off. I picked up my bag and walked to it. She said nothing when I got in. Neither did I. We drove out of Fall River in silence, taking the route toward the Woods Hole ferry terminal, and the silence had the quality of something shared rather than absent the silence of 2 people who have worked toward the same thing for a long time and understand that it is nearly done. We stopped for coffee at a service station outside of Bourne, the kind that is open all night and does not ask questions. Dorothea ordered black. I ordered the same, though I would have preferred something warmer and more complicated, because the occasion seemed to call for simplicity. We reached the vineyard on the first morning ferry as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east over Nantucket Sound, a thin line of gray, becoming pewter, becoming something that could almost be called color. The house was exactly as I had left it. I had expected to feel something particular walking back in through the front door, relief or gratitude or the weight of homecoming. What I actually felt was a quiet recognition. This was the house. It was still itself. The oak trees were bare now, their branches moving slightly against the early light, and the back porch held the particular stillness of a place in November that remembers what it will be again in May. I went upstairs, opened the closet in the primary bedroom, and took out the black suit. I had bought it 12 years ago for a judicial investiture ceremony, and had worn it perhaps a dozen times, since always on occasions that required a certain quality of presence, of being entirely and precisely oneself without apology or concession. It had been hanging in this closet for 6 weeks while I wore facility-issue clothing and moved through linoleum corridors performing the gradual dimming of a mind that had never been brighter. I put it on in the bathroom in front of the full mirror in the early morning light. The person looking back at me was 60 years old, had a left hip that still ached faintly from a Tuesday afternoon floor, had spent 6 weeks eating institutional oatmeal and sleeping on a thin mattress and conducting a legal operation of considerable complexity from a room overlooking a parking lot, and was not by any reasonable measure a woman who should be underestimated. I straightened the jacket. I looked at myself directly the way I had learned to look at things that required clear seeing. "Hello, Eleanor," I said. Then I went downstairs and helped Dorothea prepare the house for Friday evening. The invitations had gone out 2 days earlier, dispatched through a Boston law firm that Agent Steed's office had coordinated for the purpose. They were formal cream-colored, printed in the restrained typography of professional correspondence. They were addressed to Julian and Clara Vance, to Silas Thorne, and to Warren Price separately, so that none of them would know the others had been invited. The text described a dinner at the Martha's Vineyard estate to mark in the words of the invitation the successful conclusion of the Vance family estate management proceedings. It was deliberately vague enough for each recipient to fill in with whatever outcome they had been hoping for. Julian called that afternoon at 2:30 while I was arranging chairs in the front room with Dorothea. "Mom," he said, and his voice carried a warmth I recognized, the warmth of a man who believes good news has arrived. "Did you get an invitation to the vineyard for Friday?" "I did," I said. "Are you going to be there?" I looked through the front window at the bare oak trees, at the November light on the water beyond them. "I will be there," I said. "I will see you there, son." I ended the call and set the phone in my jacket pocket and stood at the window for a moment. Friday was 2 days away. The party. I had arrived at the house 4 hours before the guests. 2 days of preparation had changed the front rooms in the particular way that careful intention changes a space, not dramatically, not beyond recognition, but with the quality of attention that makes a place feel inhabited by purpose. Dorothea had brought flowers, autumn ones, the kind that hold their color without apology in November. We had arranged the furniture to allow movement, placed the champagne and ice on the sideboard, lit the standing lamps against the early dark that comes to the vineyard by 4 in the afternoon this time of year. The large screen on the far wall of the sitting room, a device Robert had installed 6 years ago and used almost exclusively for streaming baseball games, had been connected to a secure server by a technician from Agent Steed's office the previous afternoon. Everything was ready. The guests arrived beginning at 6:30. The first to come were the ones who were not what they appeared to be. 8 individuals over the course of 40 minutes, some presenting themselves as associates of the coordinating law firm, others as financial advisory representatives, others simply as attendants of the evening. They were dressed appropriately for a professional dinner at Martha's Vineyard in late November. Good jackets, restrained colors, the general appearance of people who work in finance or law and attend events like this as a professional matter. They accepted champagne, they made quiet conversation, they distributed themselves around the room with the natural ease of people who know exactly where they need to be. Agent Norma Steed arrived among the first group. She was 44 years old, which I had not fully registered when Dorothea described her. She was shorter than the room suggested she should be. The word methodical had made me expect someone larger, and she moved through the space with an economy of motion that I recognized as the signature of someone who has learned to observe without being observed. She took a position near the bookshelf along the east wall, accepted a glass of champagne she did not drink, and waited. I watched all of this from the top of the staircase. I had positioned myself on the landing before the first guest arrived close enough to the wall to be invisible from below, at an angle that gave me a clear view of the front rooms through the stair rails. It was not a comfortable position, but I had stood in more uncomfortable ones over the course of the preceding months, and the discomfort had a different quality when what you were waiting for was nearly finished. Warren Price arrived at 6:50 alone in a jacket that was slightly too casual for the occasion. He looked around the room with the evaluating eye of a man who is always, on some level, appraising property, and took a position near the far corner where he could watch the door. He had the particular watchfulness of someone who has received an unexpected invitation and has not yet decided whether it represents an opportunity or a problem. Silas Thorne arrived at 7:15. He came in through the front door and stopped just inside it the way he always did when entering a space. A pause so brief it would register to most people as nothing but that I recognized after 2 decades of watching him as a deliberate act of environmental assessment. He looked at the room. He looked at the people in it. Something moved across his face, not quite recognition, not quite alarm, but the earliest precursor of both. He had not been in this house for 11 years. He had not expected to be comfortable here. But something beyond mere discomfort was registering. He could not, I believed, have named it precisely. The faces around him were unfamiliar, but not in any way he could identify as wrong. The event was what it appeared to be. The champagne was real. The flowers were real. And yet, he took a glass from the tray that was offered to him and found a position near the window that gave him sightlines to both the front door and the far wall. Julian and Clara arrived together at 7:22. Clara came in first the way she always did in rooms she'd decided to own. She was wearing a black dress and the pearl necklace, the one I had noticed on the afternoon she sat on my back porch, assessing the value of everything she could see. The pearls had been there at every significant event in the 4 years I had known her arriving, precisely when she needed to look like old money and not merely new ambition. She touched them briefly at her collarbone as she crossed the threshold, a gesture so habitual she was certainly unaware she made it. Julian was behind her in a suit that fit well and an expression I had not seen on him in several years. He looked genuinely pleased. He had interpreted the invitation exactly as it had been designed to be interpreted as good news, arriving in a formal package, a professional confirmation that some process had concluded in his favor. He had not asked which process. He had allowed himself to be relieved. He scanned the room, nodded to Warren with the brief recognition of 2 people who've conducted business together, and accepted champagne with the ease of a man who believes the evening will go well. Beckett came in last behind his parents in the gray sweatshirt and canvas shoes that were his standard uniform. He walked to the far side of the room and stood against the wall near the bookshelf, his tablet under his arm, his expression neutral. He did not look up at the staircase. But I saw his left hand, the one not holding the tablet, make a small, brief movement at his side. 2 fingers extended, then closed. A signal we had not planned that he had invented on his own. I understood it. It meant I see you, I am here, we are ready. At 7:30, the lights in the sitting room dimmed slowly from their full brightness to something lower and more focused. The shift was gradual enough that it might have seemed atmospheric, a host's adjustment of mood, had anyone been paying attention to the lighting. Most people in the room were not. Clara raised her champagne glass in the direction of no one in particular, the social instinct of a woman who has learned to perform confidence at the exact moment it is most useful. Julian smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in longer than I could precisely remember, unguarded, briefly real, the smile of someone who believes they have arrived somewhere good. Then the screen on the far wall came to life. Before I show you what appeared on that screen, before I tell you what Eleanor had prepared 6 weeks earlier, sitting alone at that desk, I need to know you are still here. Type justice in the comments, 1 word, that is all. Because what happens next changed everything for everyone in that room. Note this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Names, places, and certain details are not drawn from any single source, but what this story is about is something very worth hearing. The video. I had recorded the message 6 weeks earlier, the night before I walked into Maplewood, sitting at Robert's desk in the study with the camera positioned on the shelf where he used to keep his engineering manuals. Watching it play from the top of the staircase in a house full of people who did not yet know I was there was one of the stranger experiences of my life. The woman on the screen was dressed in the black suit. Her hands were folded on the desk in front of her, a habit from the bench, the posture of someone who has learned that stillness communicates authority more reliably than movement. She looked directly into the camera, and when she spoke, her voice had the particular quality I had spent 30 years cultivating, measured, precise, and entirely without apology. The room below me went very quiet. She said, "My name is Eleanor Ruth Vance. I am a retired Associate Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. I am 60 years old, I'm in excellent health, and I have never had any symptom of cognitive impairment. The documentation suggesting otherwise was prepared at my direction and represents my own self-reported descriptions recorded by a physician friend under standard medical protocol. It constitutes no clinical diagnosis. It was a tool, and it has served its purpose." I watched Julian's face from the staircase. He had turned toward the screen when the video began the way everyone in the room had with the polite attention of a guest at an event whose program has started. That attention had shifted into something else within the first 10 seconds. His champagne glass had lowered to his side. His jaw had tightened in the specific way it had since childhood when he encountered information his mind needed additional time to process. The woman on the screen continued. She explained the Martha's Vineyard property, the transfer to the Vance Family Charitable Foundation, in March of 2016, 8 years and 8 months before Warren Price had driven across the Bourne Bridge with a purchase and sale agreement. She cited the Registry of Deeds entry the foundation's registered status under Massachusetts nonprofit law and the legal nullity of any transaction purporting to convey title the seller did not hold. She noted, without particular emphasis, that conducting a real estate transaction on property you do not own with the knowledge that proper title verification had been deliberately skipped has a name in Massachusetts law, and that name is fraud. Warren Price in the corner set his champagne glass on the windowsill with a care that suggested his hands were not entirely steady. The woman on the screen moved to the cold wallet. She described the device the recovery phrase engraved inside the wedding ring and the transfer she had completed 2 years after Robert's death, the full $10 million in cryptocurrency valuation distributed through a federally supervised fiduciary to verified victims of investment fund misconduct. She cited the case file number. She noted that the list of named complainants was a matter of federal record and that anyone interested in reviewing it could request it through the appropriate regulatory office. Julian had gone completely still. Then she addressed Silas Thorne. She had known Silas Thorne for 22 years. She had watched him operate at the intersection of political influence and financial self-interest for 2 decades, and she had been in possession for the past 14 years of documentary evidence relating to payments made by Thorne to 3 state officials during a period when he held elected office payments that had never been disclosed as required by law to the relevant ethics oversight bodies. She had provided that evidence in its complete form to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office the previous Tuesday. Thorne near the window did not move, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. The video ran for 11 minutes in total. When it ended with the woman on the screen saying simply and without flourish, "I believe that covers the foundation," there was a silence in the room below me of the kind that follows the end of something significant. Then Dorothea Crane stepped forward from the edge of the room. She was holding the leather portfolio. She addressed the room in the voice she uses for proceedings, clear, unhurried, with the precision of someone who knows that every word she says in a professional capacity is potentially a matter of record. She explained that 3 weeks into Eleanor's stay at Maplewood, Julian Vance had signed an authorization to release financial records and account information to a designated financial oversight entity. She noted that the document title had been clearly printed at the top of the page. She noted that the signed authorization had been provided to federal investigators who had used it as the legal basis for accessing Julian's financial account records, an access that had revealed, among other things, an undisclosed offshore account structure involving a Cayman Islands entity and a pattern of unreported income extending across 4 tax years. She noted that this was a matter now under active federal investigation. She noted that the attempt to sell the Martha's Vineyard property, despite the seller having no legal title to convey, had been fully documented, including the instruction given to the listing agent to forego the standard title verification. She noted that the attempt to destroy documents under a federal preservation order, conducted at Silas Thorne's direction, by an employee who had subsequently entered into a cooperation agreement with federal investigators was also documented. She closed the portfolio. Clara's champagne glass hit the floor. The sound it made, sharp, definitive, crystalline, was very loud in the silence of the room. No one moved. No one reached for the pieces. The sound seemed to occupy the air for a moment longer than physics strictly required. Then from the top of the staircase came the sound of footsteps. Court is in session. I had walked into courtrooms for 30 years. I knew how to make an entrance. The staircase at the Vineyard House has 14 steps, and I descended each of them at the pace I had always used to approach the bench, not hurried, not performative. Simply present each step placed with the deliberateness of someone who knows where they are going and has considered the weight of arriving there. The black suit, the posture, the hands at my sides, not in my pockets, not folded simply there as they had always been, carrying nothing and making no apology for that. The room registered me before anyone spoke. It happened in the way that rooms shift when something changes at their center, not loudly, not all at once, but in the way a current moves through water. I saw it pass across the faces closest to the staircase, first then outward. The FBI agents in their professional attire did not react because they had been expecting me. Everyone else reacted in the way that people react to seeing something they had arranged their entire understanding around, unmistakably present and entirely contrary to what that understanding required. Julian's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and did not break because he caught it a reflex, the body acting before the mind had time to explain what it was seeing. Clara did not move. She stood exactly where she had been standing, her hand still raised from the gesture of the toast that no longer meant what it had meant 12 seconds ago, and she looked at me, coming down the stairs, with an expression I had not seen from her before. It was not anger. It was something that preceded anger the moment before calculation becomes available again. Silas Thorne said nothing. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had suspected for days and had hoped was wrong. I reached the bottom of the staircase. Beckett crossed the room. He moved from his position near the bookshelf with the same unhurried purpose I had come down the stairs with, and he came to stand beside me, not behind me, not in front of me, but at my left side, with the easy certainty of someone who has chosen which side of a line to stand on and has no remaining uncertainty about that choice. He was still holding his tablet. He was still wearing the gray sweatshirt and the worn canvas shoes. He was 14 years old, and he stood there as though he had been doing it all his life. Julian looked at his son. I had expected many things from Julian in this moment. I had prepared over the preceding months for anger, for denial, for the particular kind of bargaining that intelligent people attempt when they understand that a situation has closed around them, but believe that the right argument might still reopen it. I had prepared for him to speak. He did not speak. He looked at Beckett standing beside me, and something happened in his face that I had not seen there since Julian was perhaps 10 years old, an expression without management, without the layer of self-presentation that adults construct and eventually forget they are wearing. He looked for a moment like a man who understood something about himself that he had been avoiding understanding for a very long time. Then Clara moved. She stepped forward from where she had been standing, and her voice, when it came, was not the voice I had heard in 8 weeks of recordings, the controlled, calibrated instrument of a woman who had decided, in advance, what effect each word should have. This voice was uncontrolled, and therefore, in its own way, more honest than anything else she had said in the 4 years I had known her. "You cannot do this," she said. "This is our family. These are family matters. You cannot do this." She was looking at me. I let her finish. Then I said, "No, this is not a family matter." I looked at the room, at the people Dorothea and Agent Steed had placed around its edges, at Warren Price still standing by the window, with the stillness of a man who has accepted that the evening has not gone the way he needed it to, at Silas Thorne, whose expression had settled into something that was almost dignity and might, in another man, have approached it. "This," I said, "is a courtroom, and court is in session." Agent Norma Steed moved from her position by the east wall. She was carrying a portfolio of her own thinner than Dorothea's, containing a specific category of documents that had been prepared and authorized in the preceding 48 hours. Federal arrest warrants require probable cause and judicial authorization before they can be executed. The warrants Agent Steed was carrying had been signed by a federal magistrate judge the previous afternoon on the basis of the investigative record that the preceding 2 months had assembled. She identified herself by name, title, and agency. She stated that she was executing federal arrest warrants. She named each individual in turn. Julian Randolph Vance, federal securities fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. Clara Ashford Vance, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, obstruction, conspiracy to abuse legal process. Silas Martin Thorne, bribery of public officials, conspiracy, destruction of evidence under federal preservation order. Warren James Price, real estate fraud, conspiracy. Each name landed in the room with the weight that names carry when they are read from a legal document in an official capacity, not the weight of accusation, which can be disputed, but the weight of process, which has already begun. The agents who had been positioned around the room moved to their assigned positions with the economy of motion that comes from preparation. There were no raised voices. There was no struggle. Julian put his champagne glass on the sideboard with the careful attention of a man performing a very small, manageable action in the middle of something unmanageable. They led him toward the front door. At the threshold, he stopped and turned and looked at me across the room. I do not know what he was looking for. I have thought about it in the time since, and I have not arrived at a satisfying answer. He was not looking at Beckett, who was still standing beside me. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at me, specifically, with an expression that contained too many things for me to name them separately. I held his gaze. I did not look away. I did not look down. I gave him the thing I had always given the people who stood before me in courtrooms when everything had been said and the only remaining thing was the truth of the situation, my full attention without qualification for as long as he needed it. Then the agent beside him said his name quietly, and he turned, and he went through the door. The November night came in briefly through the open door, and then the door closed, and the house was changed. Beckett's hand found mine in the quiet that followed. I held it. The vineyard in November. After everyone had gone, the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in months. It emptied gradually the way rooms empty after significant events, first the FBI agents efficient and unceremonious in their departure, moving in pairs through the front door and down the gravel drive to the vehicles that had been parked beyond the tree line since 6 o'clock. Then the law firm associates and the financial advisory representatives offering brief professional nods to Dorothea and retrieving their coats from the hallway closet with the composure of people trained to conclude difficult evenings without visible residue. Agent Steed was the last to leave of that group, and she paused in the doorway to speak briefly with Dorothea in a voice too low for me to hear from the sitting room. Then the door closed. Dorothea moved through the remaining rooms with quiet efficiency, gathering documents into her portfolio, making notes in the small leather notebook she carried in her jacket pocket. She would have a considerable amount of work in the days ahead. The administrative conclusion of proceedings that had taken months to build rarely concludes in an evening. However, definitively that evening ends. The Vance Family Charitable Foundation would formally assume stewardship of the property. The federal investigation into Julian's fund and offshore arrangements would continue through its own processes. The Rhode Island Attorney General's office would determine what Silas Thorne's cooperation or lack of it meant for the bribery charges. None of that was finished, but the part that required Eleanor Vance to be in a room was finished. Beckett found me standing at the back door. I had drifted there without deciding to the way the body sometimes moves toward the thing it needs before the mind has formulated the request. The back door opens onto the porch, and the porch faces the water. And in November, on the vineyard, the water is dark and very present, moving in the particular way of the Atlantic in the cold months. Not the gentle summer water, but the purposeful water. The water that is going somewhere, and has been going there for a very long time and will continue going there long after the houses along its edge are dust. Beckett pushed the door open and we stepped out together. The night was cold. The temperature had dropped while the evening proceeded inside, and the salt air had an edge to it that I felt at once in my hands and at the back of my throat. The oak trees at the edge of the property moved slowly against the sky. We sat on the porch swing, the one Robert had hung from the beam above us in the summer of 2003, replacing the old one that had finally given up after 2 decades of use, using the same hardware because the beam had been drilled to those measurements, and he preferred not to change what already worked. For a while, neither of us said anything. The water moved. The trees moved. The porch swing moved slightly under our combined weight with the barely perceptible back and forth that it has always had, that particular rhythm that is not quite stillness but closer to it than anything else I know. Then Beckett said, "Are you okay, Grandma?" He asked it the way he asked everything directly, without softening the edges, because he had learned somewhere along the way that softening the edges of a genuine question is a form of dishonesty. I thought about the answer with the seriousness it deserved. I did not reach for the response that would be reassuring, the one that would make him comfortable and close the conversation cleanly. I thought about it as a question that had a real answer. "I will be," I said. It was the truest thing I could offer. Not a present state, but a direction. I will be, which means I am not yet, which means I am acknowledging what is actually here. What was here at that moment was not triumph. I had spent 6 months building something precise and necessary, and I had seen it work exactly as designed. And the man who had stood in this house 4 hours ago, smiling with a genuine warmth that predated everything that had gone wrong between us, had been led out the front door by a federal agent and would not come back to this house in any way I could currently imagine. He was my son. I had not allowed myself to hold that fact in any unguarded way for the preceding months, because holding it would have made the other things impossible. You cannot set a trap for someone you are allowing yourself to fully feel the love for. I had known this from the beginning and had acted accordingly, and it had been the correct decision, and it had cost me something I had not finished calculating yet. The tears came without announcement, the way they sometimes do when the thing you have been not doing finally finds the space you have cleared for it by finishing what needed to be done first. I did not try to stop them. There was no one in this moment whose perception of me required management. I thought about Robert, who had watched Julian grow from the baby we had brought home to this house into the man who had been led away from it, and who had somehow known with the patient clarity he brought to things he loved that a plan would eventually be needed. He had written it down. He had left it in the safe. He had trusted me to read it when the time came and know what to do. I had done what he asked. I sat on the porch in the November cold and looked at the water and thought, "Robert, I did what you asked. I hope it was the right thing." I thought it probably was. I also thought that certainty about that was something I would be working toward for a long time, and that the working toward it was not a problem, but simply the shape of what came next. Beckett had not moved beside me. He sat with the still patience of a boy who understands that some silences require company rather than interruption. After a while, I cannot say how long the cold had begun to settle into my jacket, and the swing had slowed to its minimum movement. I heard his breathing change. The gradual deepening and evening out that signals the crossing from wakefulness to sleep. His head came to rest against my shoulder. I sat very still. The November water moved in the dark. The oak trees Robert and I had planted the year Julian was born stood at the edge of the property and held their bare branches against the sky. I had one thing left to do. After that, I would be done. The last verdict. The next morning was a Saturday, and the November light on the water was thin and very clear. I had slept in the house for the first time in 6 weeks in the primary bedroom, with the window that faces east, and I woke before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the way I have woken for most of my adult life, regardless of what the previous evening contained. The room was cold. The house had been closed for the weeks of my absence, and the heating system had not yet fully compensated. I lay still for a few minutes and listened to the water. Then I got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in Robert's reading chair, which I had moved to the kitchen years ago, because it was where he had always ended up in the mornings, and because a house should be lived in according to the truth of how people actually inhabit it rather than the theory of where furniture is supposed to go. The papers Dorothea had left for me were in a folder on the table. I had looked at them once the previous evening before I went to bed. They were what they appeared to be, a donation agreement formalizing the transfer of Eleanor Vance's remaining personal assets to the Massachusetts Library System's Endowment Fund, which supports the acquisition and preservation of legal and historical archives across the state's public libraries. I had been in conversations with the endowment office for the preceding 3 months. They had been patient and professional and had asked no questions about my timeline that I was not prepared to answer. I signed where indicated. I initialed the pages that required initials. I placed the papers back in the folder and left it on the table for Dorothea, who would collect it when she returned that morning to complete the transfer documentation. Beckett woke at 7:15 and came downstairs in his socks, with his hair uncombed, which was the most 14-year-old he had looked in the entire duration of his involvement in something that had required considerably more than 14 years of experience to understand. He sat across from me with his own cup of coffee. He had discovered coffee the previous year, a development I found both alarming and appropriate. And we ate the bread Dorothea had left in the kitchen and did not talk about the previous evening, because there was nothing about the previous evening that needed to be talked about by the two people who had been most present for it. After a while, he said, "What happens now, for me, I mean?" He was asking about the practical shape of the days ahead. His parents were in federal custody. His school was in Boston. The immediate logistics of his life had been significantly rearranged by the preceding 12 hours. I told him that Dorothea had already been in contact with my sister Margaret. Margaret Vance Holloway was 63 years old and lived in a wide-porched house in Concord she had owned for 20 years. She had a spare room. She had raised 3 children, and she had been aware for several weeks that she might be needed because I had called her myself in October and told her everything. She was the steadiest person I had ever known outside of Robert and Constance Darby. Beckett would finish the school term from Concord. The rest would be determined through the legal processes that were now underway. He nodded in the way that meant he had more questions and was choosing not to ask them yet because he understood they had answers, and the answers would come in time. I reached into my jacket pocket. The ring was a plain gold band, heavier than it looked, worn smooth on the outer surface from 34 years of daily wear. I had placed it there the previous evening after taking it from the small box in the dresser drawer, where I had kept it since the week after Robert's funeral. I had taken it out that day, intending to wear it again, and found that I could not because of grief, though grief was present, but because it was not mine to keep. It had always been meant to travel forward. I set it on the table in front of Beckett. He looked at it without touching it. "Your grandfather wore this for 34 years, I said. He used the inside of it to hide the most important thing he had left to give. Not money, not property. His trust in the person who would eventually find it." Beckett was quiet. "He would have wanted you to have it," I said. "Not what was inside it. The ring. What the ring means." Beckett picked it up. He turned it over in his hands the way his grandfather had turned tools and problems and questions slowly with full attention, in no hurry to arrive at the conclusion, before he had examined the thing completely. Then he put it in his sweatshirt pocket. "Okay," he said. I left at 9:30. Dorothea arrived as I was putting my bag in the car, and we stood in the driveway for a moment without saying much. She had been my attorney for 14 years, and my friend for nearly as long. And there are people you do not need to explain things to at the end because they have been present for the full duration and already know what there is to say. I told her to take care of the boy. She told me she would. I drove to the Vineyard Haven ferry terminal and parked in the long-term lot. Dorothea would arrange for the car to be collected. I walked to the dock with my single bag and did not look back at the parking lot. The ferry was a quarter full at that hour, a few workers, a couple with luggage, an older man in a fishing jacket who slept with his chin on his chest from the moment he sat down. As the boat moved away from the dock, I stood at the stern and watched the island recede. The house was not visible from the water at that angle, but the tree line was the dark shapes of the oaks along the property edge, bare against the November sky, moving slightly in the harbor wind. I watched them until the distance made them indistinguishable from the rest of the shore. Before I left the driveway that morning, I had taken a note card from the stack in the kitchen drawer, the same stock Robert had used for his index card annotations, cream-colored, unlined, and written 4 words on it in my normal handwriting. Not the careful, judicial hand I used for formal documents, just my handwriting. I had pinned it to the front door with a thumbtack from the junk drawer. It read, "Love is free. Betrayal always has a price." A reporter called at 10:47 while the ferry was crossing the Sound. I watched the number appear on my phone, a Massachusetts area code I did not recognize, and I let it ring until it stopped. Somewhere behind me, the island had disappeared into the gray horizon. I turned forward and watched the mainland come. People call this grandma revenge, and perhaps they are right. But here's what I want you to know about grandma revenge. It is not born from anger. It is built from patience, from truth, and from 30 years of knowing exactly where the line is. My faith has always taught me that God sees the rooms we think are private. He saw mine. He saw theirs. This was raw revenge, not the clean, satisfying kind from the movies. Raw revenge built on love and law leaves marks on everyone. I walked away alone. I walked away with a ferry ticket and a note on a door and a boy who had his grandfather's eyes. Raw revenge at its best is simply necessary. Do not be like me. Do not wait until the damage is done to protect what matters. Do not let the people who smile at your face count what is behind you. That is the only lesson I have left. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment. Stay close for what comes next. Thank you for being here until the very end. A note: the stories ahead contain fictionalized elements for reflective and educational purposes. Stay if it serves you. Leave if it does not.